The audio was not on. Can you hear me? Can you hear me, guys? I can't hear anybody. Hello?
Yeah. Okay, I'm see. Hello.
Vishnu and Ganga, can you
Yeah.
you can see me and hear me, right?
Yes, I can hear you now.
But I wasn't.
Dr. Ashni saying, welcome to the program.
Thanks a lot, Vishnu, Ganga. Good to see you too. I'm not hearing anything at all other than the three of us.
Yeah. I,
I couldn't hear Shamisa's introduction, for example.
I couldn't hear too.
Yeah. So I think there's a problem with the sound.
okay. All right. All right. Bring you, but welcome. So I was just wondering.
Can we do the recording in parts?
I don't know, but so Ganga, my not only could we not hear, but my staff are telling me that they couldn't hear too, so the public couldn't hear. Vishnu. So it's not just that we can't hear in the studio. The public couldn't hear. My staff are telling me that they're monitoring it and nobody can hear in the public. The public streaming is muted.
the settings switch might need some kind of adjustment.
Doctor, if you could, maybe you could moderate in the interim period.
The broadcast is
Dr. Ganga, you're
recording.
hearing me?
Yes.
Are you hearing me? Are either one of you hearing me?
Yes, I'm hearing.
Yes, or Dr. Ashni?
I can hear you, Vishnu, and I can hear Ganga too.
Okay, all right, because times I'm hearing it and at times I'm not. So it at any rate, Dr. Ashni is saying welcome. And could you just give us an update of some of the current programs the government has in place to address some of the social problems that have people have been discussing in recent weeks?
Sure. Thank you very much. So you can hear me clearly now.
Okay.
Hello, Vishnu, can you hear me? Ganga, you can hear me?
Yes, very clearly.
Very good. So let me go ahead. I'm not getting a response from Vishnu, but I assume he can hear. So Vishnu just asked a question about some of the pressing issues that we're confronting in Guyana most recently. Let me focus my attention particularly on economic issues and say that, and maybe take a slightly longer window view of things. As you know, when we came into office in August of 2020, when President Ali took the oath of office on the 2nd of August 2020, we found a situation where essentially the economy was in a state of complete collapse. This was, of course, as a result of the bad economic policies of the 5 years that preceded our assumption of office. It was as a result of the economic.
You have a prepared set of questions.
It was as a result of the sustained deterioration of economic confidence as a result of political developments. Political developments, first of all, associated with the refusal by the APNU AFC to respect the consequences of the no confidence motion, and then subsequently the refusal of the APNU AFC to respect the outcome of the elections. And so the accumulation of these political conditions resulted in a dramatic disappearance, a complete disappearance of investor confidence in Guyana, a contraction and dissipation of consumer confidence in Guyana, and essentially the economy had ground to a halt. Nobody was investing, nobody was expanding, nobody was producing. And then on top of that, you had, of course, COVID-19. The pandemic arrived in Guyana in March or April 2020, and that added an additional layer of pressure on the economy. Obviously, a sharp lockdown was instituted. Several sectors essentially stopped operating. Several people were out of work and therefore without an income, and for several months. And those were the circumstances in which President Ali's government assumed office in August 2020. We then had to set about immediately restoring some degree of injecting once again some measure of oxygen into the economy, breathing some life back into the economy. And first and foremost, of course, keeping our people safe, navigating the COVID-19 crisis, ensuring that people were protected and kept safe. And I can come back and speak a little bit about what we did in that regard. Like I said, injecting some oxygen into the economy, getting the economy back on its feet, starting a phased reopening of the economy, restoring investor confidence and consumer confidence, and essentially putting the economy back on a path of back on some path of growth and job creation, etc. So that was the task that confronted us, and we set about that task diligently from the very first day that the president assumed office. He set about confronting this task. And I'd be happy to come back and speak about some of the specific things that we did to address this issue. And having done that, we saw a return to growth in the Guyanese economy. We saw Guyana once again embarking on a path where we have now become, in fact, a sharp acceleration in growth, with the consequence that we're, in fact, now one of the fastest growing economies in the world, driven largely by oil and gas, but also reflecting the very strong emphasis that we've been placing on the achievement and further strengthening of a competitive and rapidly growing non-oil economy. And so we're in a situation now in 2022 where we're projecting overall real GDP expansion in the order of about 56%. That's our latest projection. And we're looking at non-oil growth of about between 8 and 9%, which of course are extremely respectable numbers. That has, of course, brought with it a significant amount of job creation and income generation. But having said that, we continue obviously to be a part of a global economic system that is still navigating some very difficult times. And as you would know, my fellow panelists would know, many of you are based in the United States of America, as our viewers would know, the global economy is still going through, and indeed is going through, some extremely difficult times. First and foremost, the major economies of the world are still facing the fallout of COVID-19 through things like disruption to the supply chain, elevated costs of freight, etc. But in addition to that, the preeminent challenge that the global economy is facing is a sustained convergence of inflationary pressure. And so most of the major economies of the world are facing elevated inflationary pressures as a result of commodity price escalation, oil prices, fertilizer prices, food price inflation is a global phenomenon that economies around the world are facing. And so there's a convergence around the world of global inflationary pressures. And this has brought, of course, a series of responses by the major capitals of the world to try to contain the inflationary pressures. A number of countries are now rolling out a menu of both fiscal. I'm sorry, I'm hearing a lot of interference in the background. Am I the only one hearing this interference, or is the public hearing this interference too? I'm hearing a constant fiddling and noise in the background.
I'm not hearing anything.
You're not hearing it?
No.
Okay. Well, perhaps it's only at my end. But can you hear me clearly? Because I wouldn't want the viewers not to be hearing me clearly.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. So as I was saying, what you now have is you have inflationary pressures, and you have a number of the major capitals of the world correctly and appropriately rolling out a series of measures aimed at reining in inflation. And the risk that they face and that we face as a global economy is that in crafting our responses to reining in inflation, which obviously has to be done, we have to be mindful of the need not to slow things down at a pace that will in fact result in elevated risks of recession. And so that's the challenge that is being faced by the global economy right now. In fact, I should have said that I'm actually joining this call from Washington, D.C., where the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank are convening their annual meetings, and I'm participating in those meetings right now. And that's the challenge that's facing economic policymakers around the world. Now, in Guyana, we have, of course, not been exempt from these pressures. In Guyana, we have seen the consequences of high fuel prices passing through to the fuel pump in Guyana. We have seen the pressures of imported food price inflation. Can I ask that those who are not speaking kindly mute their microphones so that we don't get the feedback? Because I'm getting a lot of feedback here. And I think the program has a facility. There's a mute button there that you can click to mute your microphone when you're not speaking. I will do the same when I'm not speaking. So, as I was saying, in Guyana, we have faced the same pressures as everybody around the world. We've seen escalated oil prices. We have had to craft a number of responses, including several measures, which I'm going to come back to. We have seen imported food price pressures. We have seen the pressures of escalated freight costs, all feeding into the domestic economy and all having an impact on cost of living domestically. What have we done in response to this? We want to make sure in Guyana, and President Ali's commitment and our government's commitment is to ensure that the Guyanese citizens are protected as far as we possibly can. And so we have implemented a series of measures aimed at protecting Guyanese citizens and Guyanese residents. Let me mention just a few of these. First, we recognized the elevation of freight costs, and we implemented a measure aimed at capping the impact of freight costs on import taxes. So we basically set a cap on the freight cost that will be incorporated in the CIF value for the purposes of calculating CIF value for import taxes. 2, we made successive dramatic reductions in fuel price in the taxes on refined fuel products. So we reduced successively from 50 to 35%, then from 35% to 20%, then from 20% to 10%, and then from 10% to 0. So we implemented successive reductions in the excise taxes on refined fuel products, gasoline and diesel in particular. And we maintained a 0 tax rate on kerosene, because kerosene is used primarily by the most vulnerable sections of society. And what that did is it allowed fuel consumers in Guyana to be able to not have to bear the full brunt of a full pass-through of imported price escalation in the oil prices. And so whereas fuel prices on the international market grew by perhaps nearly 150% since 2020, the price at the pump grew in Guyana by a much lower percentage, perhaps less than 50%. And so that was a deliberate measure, because we recognize how important fuel prices are, not only to consumers for final consumption. This is like transportation, cost of transportation, gasoline for your car, gasoline to be used in the public transportation sector, like minibuses and so on, taxis and so on. But also fuel is an important input in productive activity. Fuel is an important input in agriculture for food production, and fuel is an important input in other productive activity like mining and so on. And so what this measure allowed us to do is, by doing this measure, we cushion not only the impact on final consumers of fuel, but we also cushion the impact of imported price pressures on productive activity like fuel, like in agriculture and in mining. In addition to that, of course, we removed taxes. We removed taxes on a number of items that the APNU AFC had taxed. You would know that during the 5 years that they were in government, they put more taxes on more than 200 items, including VAT on electricity, VAT on water, VAT on basic medical supplies, VAT on basic educational supplies, VAT on agricultural inputs, VAT on heavy equipment, and all of those things were placing a tremendous drag on the cost of production in the productive sector and a tremendous drag on disposable incomes in family, which was being borne by households in Guyana and families in Guyana. So we reversed all of these punitive tax measures that had been implemented by the APNU AFC during 2015 to 2020. That also helped to cushion impact on disposable inflationary pressures on domestic households. Then, of course, we implemented a number of targeted measures aimed at providing support to the most vulnerable. For example, we reintroduced the cash grant to parents of school-age children. That now transfers in excess of 6 billion Guyana dollars to the disposable incomes or to the pockets of parents of school-age children, because we want to make sure that parents are still able to send their children to school. We increased old age pensions. We implemented a cash grant to residents of riverine and hinterland communities. We are providing support for fertilizer acquisition for the agricultural sector, and the list goes on. I will probably pause there because I know the other panelists would want to come in. But the point really that I want to make is that it has taken a lot of work and very intense effort since President Ali assumed office. It's taken a lot of work that we're firmly committed to since the president assumed office. First of all, to restore life to the Guyanese economy after an extremely difficult 5 years, an extremely difficult 2 years, from 2.5 years from December 2018, and an even more difficult 5 months from March 2020 to August 2020. It took a lot of very hard work and concerted effort to restore life to the Guyanese economy, to restore some measure of well-being to the Guyanese people, and this work is ongoing. And finally, before I conclude on this particular point, we are now, just as policymakers around the world are confronting, we are now confronting the same pressures, in particular the pressures in particular inflationary pressures, and we have very actively implemented a number of measures aimed at managing and mitigating these pressures. Let me pause there to allow other panelists to come in, and I'll be happy to take any questions that you might have.
Yeah, Minister, first of all, we apologize for those technical problems at the beginning. It's the first time that ever happened on this show, so we're sorry about that. Before I proceed to ask you a question on the NRF, which is something that people got conflicting information about, they are not too clear. It happened both, well, it's being peddled primarily by opposition forces, but also within some PVP circles. But before why is it that your government did so much to alleviate the suffering of people during the COVID and beyond, and yet the PNC and other people are arguing that you have not done enough to ease inflationary pressures on the people? What do you say to them?
Well, let me say this, that the job of a political opposition is to criticize the incumbent government. And the APNU AFC is doing, in the best way that they believe they can do, this job. The only problem is that they are refusing to acknowledge that many of the challenges that the Guyanese economy is facing and faced during the 2020 to 2022 period, many of those challenges are the direct result of the punitive policies that they themselves implemented from 2015 to 2020 that have had to be reversed. And that fact, they are in fact not willing to acknowledge and refusing to accept. Now, I gave a number of examples of measures that they implemented that were harmful to the Guyanese economy. And I mean, I can mention a few more. If you take the agriculture sector, and agriculture, food production is absolutely critical to consumer prices, because if you don't have adequate food production, food is a very significant contributor to the consumption basket. And the more vulnerable the household, the bigger the share is of food in the total consumption basket. And so it's absolutely important to keep food production high and to continue to grow food production, because food production has a critical impact on domestic price inflation. You have to have adequate supply to ensure that prices don't go up in the markets. That's basic common sense. But in addition to that, agriculture has always been a mainstay of the Guyanese economy, and in particular, a mainstay of the rural economy in Guyana. This has always been the case, and you know that, all of you know that far better than I do. The APNU AFC systematically decimated the agriculture sector during their 5 years. And they did so out of pure political vindictiveness. And I can give you many examples I don't believe that I need to speak about sugar, because the story of sugar is very well known. They came into office with a lot of promises in 2015 about what they were going to do for sugar, with the deliberate intention of misleading sugar workers in the run-up to the 2015 elections. And as soon as they got into office in 2015, they set about to close and decimate the sugar industry. That put 7,000 workers out, 7,000 sugar workers out of work, and by extension, tens of thousands of people out of their livelihoods, out of their productive activity. That story is well known. I think everybody here knows that story. Unconscionably destroying the village economy in all of the sugar producing communities and contiguous areas. So that's the first and relatively well-known point. But across agriculture, the systematic policy of disinvestment in infrastructure such as drainage and irrigation. If you don't invest in drainage and irrigation, if you don't continue to expand the infrastructure that's required for easy and affordable access to productive agricultural lands, if you don't continuously invest in maintaining and expanding your drainage and irrigation agriculture, if you maintain a deliberate stance of disinvesting in agriculture and agriculture-related infrastructure, then you are pursuing a policy of deliberate destruction of the agriculture sector. And that is what you saw over the 5-year period. And so, whereas we had put sectors like rice on a trajectory of rapid growth, the rice industry, as you know, grew tremendously under the People's Progressive Party pre-2015 government. When the APNU AFC came in as a deliberate policy, not only did they disinvest in drainage and irrigation and deliberately essentially neglect our DNI and our farm-to-market roads, etc., but also abandoned or significantly undermined efforts to maintain and expand markets. Prices, as you know, right now, there's still a large range of millers and farmers who are still in tremendous financial distress as a result of the decimation of the rice industry under the APNUAFC. And the same can be said for all other aspects of the agriculture industry. We are still feeling the fallout of those consequences. If your farm to market roads have not been maintained, they're in a state of collapse. If you go to some of the food producing areas and you see the state of the farm to market roads, they're impassable. If you go to some of the DNI structures, they're in a state of collapse as a result, and that's what we inherited in August 2020. And so that, and I'm only giving that as an example. I'm only giving that as an example of a sector where the APNUFC refuses to acknowledge how their policies decimated one of our productive sectors, and a key productive sector that has an impact not only on the economic livelihoods of the Guyanese people, but also on cost of living. What we're trying to do now is to significantly ramp up food production. As you know, let me give an example. Since I can remember myself, and those who have been in this business for a long time, Dr. Ganga Ramdas will remember this. Dr. Ramdas has been involved in this for a very long time. Dr. Tara Singh, you remember this. Vishnu, Mahendra is relatively young, but he will remember this too. Since time immemorial, Guyana has been the lead spokesperson for agriculture. We have held the quasi-cabinet, we have held responsibility for agriculture in the CARICOM quasi-cabinet configuration. So within CARICOM, there's a quasi-cabinet in CARICOM, and Guyana has always held responsibility for agriculture because Guyana has always been viewed as the breadbasket of the Caribbean. Unbelievably so. During the APNU AFC period of misrule from 2015 to 2020, and during the period of their deliberate decimation of agriculture in Guyana, Guyana gave up or lost or relinquished responsibility for agriculture in the Caribbean. Can you imagine Guyana no longer being responsible for agriculture in CARICOM when we have always been responsible for agriculture? From the time the PPP came back into office and Dr. Ali assumed the presidency, within months, Guyana was once again given responsibility for agriculture in the CARICOM quasi-cabinet configuration. And President Ali articulated, building on the Jagdeo initiative, which was an initiative piloted by President Jagdeo when he was president. President Ali took the Jagdeo initiative and elaborated it into a comprehensive plan for addressing food security in the Caribbean. And I can elaborate on that if you wish, but I will not, again, in the interest of allowing you to ask follow-up questions or in the interest of allowing other panelists to speak. Dr. Ali President Ali has now developed a comprehensive agenda for food security in the Caribbean. Now, this is not only a Caribbean initiative, it has a very strong domestic national interest perspective because agriculture is an important productive sector in Guyana. And we want to ramp up agricultural production in Guyana in order to be able to meet the demands of the Caribbean market, whether it is in crops, whether it is in livestock and meats. We want to be able to meet the needs of the Caribbean market, and we want to be able to export beyond the Caribbean market. And so we now have the 25 by 25 agenda, whose implementation is being led by President Ali, a comprehensive agenda to promote agriculture and agribusiness and the whole food security agenda as a means, like I said, of generating economic activity in Guyana, which in turn will have a number of other positive spillovers, which I could speak about, but also as a major regional initiative.
Okay, thank you. I see the Bank of Guyana report states that the country received over $1 billion in US in oil revenues. Now, I also know that you presented your budget papers stating that the government planned to withdraw about 607 million for budget support for this year. So does that $1 billion include a $607 million or is separate?
So I'm glad that you asked that question because you also, in your earlier preamble, you also alluded to public interest in the Natural Resource Fund and how that fund works, etc. And this is a very legitimate and valid public interest. Now, as many of your viewers would know, the APNU AFC went to Parliament after they lost the no confidence motion, and therefore after they had lost legitimacy as a government and they were in a period of unconstitutional rule, ignoring the fact that they had lost a no confidence motion, which should have resulted in the dissolution of Parliament and the calling of an election. They went to Parliament with a piece of legislation to introduce the Natural Resource Fund. And they took that bill to Parliament without any consultation with the then opposition, now government, the People's Progressive Party. They did not give the PPP any opportunity to provide any input in this bill. And they rammed this bill through a parliament that was already in a period of unconstitutionality because it was post no confidence motion. There was no opposition. There was no PPP opposition in the parliament at the time. There was no legitimate debate in the parliament at the time. And they had lost their mandate as a government. And so they pushed through the parliament a Natural Resource Fund Act. We immediately, led then by, at the time, opposition leader Bharat Jagdeo, now Vice President Bharat Jagdeo, the People's Progressive Party, led by the then opposition leader, now Vice President Bharat Jagdeo, publicly stated our grave reservations about the Natural Resource Fund Act that the AP and UAFC took through Parliament. And Dr. Jagdeo highlighted several specific concerns that we had about the NRF Act that the AP and UAFC pushed through Parliament. Let me highlight briefly some of those specific concerns. First of all, he registered concerns about the fact that the NRF Act did not provide adequate safeguards to ensure that all oil revenues will be deposited intact in the Natural Resource Fund. You would recall that the AP and UAFC siphoned off a signing bonus of $18 million US, parked it in a secret bank account to meet secret expenditure, lied to the people of Guyana and lied to the world when they were asked about the existence of the secret bank account and about the existence of the signing bonus. They lied to the world and said, in the words of then Finance Minister Winston Jordan, said, we neither requested nor received a signing bonus. That, of course, was subsequently demonstrated to the world to be a misrepresentation of the facts, because not only did they receive a signing bonus, but they parked it in a secret bank account and they were apparently intending to use it. We were not sure what they were intending to use it on, but it was parked in a secret bank account, which they lied publicly about. So Dr. Jagdeo said publicly, we have a concern about the potential leakage, and any NRF under a PPP government must ensure that all oil revenues will be deposited intact into the NRF. That was the first point that he made. The second point that he made was that no expenditure should be met out of the fund. No payments should be met out of the fund. No transfers should be met out of the fund. No expenditure should be met from the fund unless subject to prior parliamentary debate and prior parliamentary approval. Their act provided for a variety of expenditure to be met bypassing the parliamentary process. Expenditure to be met by direct withdrawals from the fund. Now you can imagine, this is your sovereign wealth fund. Surely you don't want expenditure to be met out of your sovereign wealth fund without prior parliamentary approval. Every dollar to be spent out of your sovereign wealth fund should be subject to ex-ante parliamentary scrutiny and ex-ante parliamentary approval. And surely it is extremely egregious that you might have a legal framework that allows expenditure to be met without prior parliamentary approval. So Dr. Jagdeo said, we find this objectionable and we will correct it. And every dollar of expenditure that comes out of the sovereign wealth fund, every dollar of expenditure that is met out of the sovereign wealth fund shall be subject to prior parliamentary examination and prior parliamentary approval. That was the second point that he made. The third point that he made was that the rule governing withdrawals from the fund must be a simple rule that is understandable by the Guyanese people. Simplicity is the friend of transparency, and complexity is the friend of opacity and the enemy of transparency. What the AP and UAFC had was a very elaborate formula to determine the amount of money to be withdrawn from the Sovereign Wealth Fund. And I am sharing this panel with a number of eminent experts. And I would gladly take a back seat and invite any one of these eminent experts to endeavor to explain this formula that was legislated by the APNU AFC in their NRF Act. It was a formula that was extremely complex and moreover was beset by one particular flaw that we found especially objectionable. And that particular flaw was that it was heavily assumptions-based. You had to make assumptions about the production level. You had to make assumptions about the market prices. You had to make assumptions about the economically sustainable amount. You had to make assumptions about the fiscally sustainable amount. So it was very heavily assumptions-based, which meant that it was highly susceptible to manipulation. As you know, once you have a formula that is very, very heavily influenced by assumptions, we can make any variety of assumptions. We can make assumptions about production. We can make assumptions about prices. We can make assumptions about what would be sustainable. There are many parameters that would influence sustainability, and we can achieve any result that we want to achieve. The PPP in opposition said, we want a simple formula that every single Guyanese person can understand. It mustn't be a mystery, and you mustn't have to have a Nobel Prize in economics or a PhD in economics to be able to understand what is the rule that will govern the transfer of money from the Natural Resource Fund to the budget. The Natural Resource Fund belongs to the people of Guyana, and every single Guyanese person must understand the rule that governs the transfer of resources from the Natural Resource Fund to the consolidated fund or to the budget. The fourth objection and concern that we raised was the governance arrangements in relation to the fund. In particular, we expressed a concern, the PPP, led by Dr. Jagdeo, expressed the specific concern about the pervasive, extensive, pervasive, extensive, and excessive powers of the Minister of Finance. Under the APNU AFC's NRF Act, the Minister of Finance was an omnipresent, omnipotent, and all-powerful authority in relation to the fund. The fund, he was responsible for the overall management of the fund. He was responsible for all key decisions in relation to the fund. He was involved in all of the decisions regarding the fund. And there was no governance body such as a board of directors. And one of the key principles contained in the Santiago Principles, and many of your viewers would be familiar with the Santiago Principles. The Santiago Principles are a set of principles agreed by the International Forum for Sovereign Wealth Funds. One of the key requirements of the Santiago Principles is that there must be a governing body like a board of directors. There was no board of directors. The APNU AFC Natural Resource Fund Act did not have a board of directors. They deliberately excluded the establishment of a board of directors, and they vested all of the powers that should be vested in a board of directors. They vested those powers in the hands of this omnipotent and omniscient Minister of Finance. And the People's Progressive Party in government said, we find that objectionable. We will reduce dramatically the powers of the Minister of Finance, and we will vest those powers in a board of directors. And finally, we expressed a concern about transparency, because you would recall this business about the 18 million that I spoke about earlier. And we said that we want every single deposit in the Natural Resource Fund not only to happen as it should, but we want there to be maximum transparency. Every deposit into the Natural Resource Fund must be published in the official gazette and must be notified and tabled in the Parliament. And so we also said that we were going to strengthen the transparency provisions in relation to the Natural Resource Fund Act. And so when we came into government, we set about drafting legislation. We didn't throw away the APNU AFC NRF fund, although there was a lot that we would have done differently and in a more robust manner. We didn't throw it all away. We took a deliberate policy that we were going to address the issues that we found most egregious and objectionable by reenacting the NRF Act and addressing those issues. And so the new NRF Act that you would have seen and the public would have seen us taking to Parliament in December, well, it would have been, I think, December 2021, that new NRF Act addressed all of those issues. It now requires, and I'm not going to speak expansively about it because I think I've addressed it exhaustively, it now requires that all oil revenues go into the fund and that every deposit be published in the Gazette and tabled in Parliament. It now requires that all withdrawals from the fund be subject to prior parliamentary approval and through a transparent process integrated in the budgetary process. It now stipulates that no withdrawals can come out of the fund and no expenditure can be met out of the fund unless subject to prior parliamentary debate and approval. It now dramatically reduces the powers of the finance minister, and it establishes for the first time a board of directors in whom those powers that were previously vested in the Minister of Finance are now vested. And so that's what the new NRF Act did. And I wanted Tara to take advantage of the opportunity of your question to elaborate on that issue. And I hope that I have lent some clarity to this question. Now, how the fund works, to come to the specific question that you asked, how the fund works is that all oil revenues get deposited into the NRF fund automatically. So whether it is our profit share or royalties, all oil revenues get deposited intact into the NRF. And funds can only be withdrawn from the NRF in keeping with the I should have said also we introduced a simplified formula that is now easy to understand. And all oil revenues can only be taken out of the fund subject to the formula, subject to a ceiling determined by the formula that is now contained in the new Act. And that formula, having defined what the ceiling is, the specific amount to be withdrawn subject to that ceiling has to be debated and approved in Parliament. So what happened in the 2022 budget is that the formula that was outlined was applied, and that formula provided that in the first year, the existing balance in the preceding year will be the ceiling. And so the balance in the year preceding the budget year, that is 2022, the balance at the end of the preceding year was essentially $607 million US. And so as part of Budget 2022's consideration in the Parliament, approval, this issue was debated and approval was granted for $607 million US to be withdrawn from the fund. And so the 607 represents, so what you're seeing reported would be the deposits into the fund and the rolling balance. Of course, the fund has an ongoing balance. The $607 million will come out of the fund, and we have already made some withdrawals out of the fund. As you know, we did, I believe, 2 previous withdrawals totaling 200 plus 200, $400 million US out of the fund. And those withdrawals went intact into the Consolidated Fund of Guyana, which is the single consolidated fund established for the purposes of meeting budgetary expenditure. So I hope I've lent some amount of clarity to this issue. Like I said, Tara, forgive me for taking advantage of your question in relation to the 607 million.
I really wanted you to elaborate that because there are a lot of
thanks a lot.
Mahendra, you have a question for the minister?
Sure. Good night, Dr. Singh, and good night, everyone on the panel. Dr. Singh, as you know, Guyana is on the trajectory of some immense economic growth. And as you alluded to, the inflationary situation on the global platform, given all of the infusion of investments across Guyana, how is the government navigating an economy situation to an overheated economy, so not to further exacerbate an inflationary situation? You spoke to a number of measures. That's one question. And secondly, with the global economy so connected, and Guyana is at the forefront of a developing nation, with the recent CPL, for example, a lot of talks were around the currency conversion rate and where would that head with respect to strengthening the Guyana dollar with US. As we know, there is US and Euro purchasing power parity. A lot of people tend to want this growth in the Guyana dollar, but doesn't really understand when there's growth in the Guyana dollar, there will also be repercussion and also impacts which can further stretch the inflationary situation and cost of living. Can you shed light on those two issues?
Thank you very much, Mahendra. And those are two. I'm glad that you asked those questions because you give me an opportunity to elaborate on two very, very critical issues. So you raised, first of all, of course, the risk of overheating. And you're absolutely correct that in an economy that is growing as rapidly as the Guyanese economy is, the reality is that there is, of course, a risk of overheating. There's no doubt about that. And Guyana is no exception in this regard. We are growing at astronomical rates. And we recognize as a government the fact that we need to carefully navigate this risk and mitigate this risk. Now, when the economy is growing as rapidly as it is, and when you have this very real reality that you potentially could see some upward price movement, it's absolutely essential that you do all that you possibly can to remove particularly the supply side constraints and the supply side bottlenecks to ramp up the supply of critical inputs. So let me give you an example. There is a rapid surge in construction activity in Guyana. Rapid. More ports, bridges, roads, warehouses, head offices, hotels, and residences are being built than at any other time in our country's history. And this places a tremendous demand. So the construction sector is one of the most rapidly growing sectors. This places a tremendous demand on the inputs that are required in construction. So you have, for example, a rapid escalation in demand for quarry material, stone, a rapid demand for silica sand, a rapid demand for other construction inputs, whether timber, cement, etc. And we recognize this. And so we have moved swiftly, first of all, to take off taxes where taxes could potentially have an impact on the cost of these inputs. So we've taken off taxes on all basic construction materials. But we also recognize the importance of ensuring that you have, in the case of domestically produced items, that we have a supply side response. And so what we have done is we have worked very hard to ensure that we lay the foundation for increased production of these items, these inputs. So you would see a number of new quarries coming on stream and ramped up production of quarry materials because the demand for quarry stone is going to be tremendous, even with the ramped up production that we anticipate as a result of the increased numbers of quarries that we anticipate will come on stream. They will also probably be, and very likely continue to be, a significant need for imported quarry stone, crusher run and stone for construction. And so we're certainly moving on the domestic side to increase production, but we also recognize that, to the extent that that response will take some time, we're encouraging and we're welcoming increased importation of quarry stone to meet the needs of the rapid growing economy. The same applies, for example, for sand production. We are actively working through the Ministry of Natural Resources and the Guyana Geology and Mines Commission, who regulate the sector. We are actively encouraging and facilitating ramped up production of construction materials, of sand in this case. Similarly, we're working with the forestry sector to promote increased and ramped up production of timber products. The products continue to be a significant input in the construction sector. Investing in hinterland roads to improve access to forestry concessions, working with the forestry sector to ensure that we have increased production and increased declarations, all within the context, of course, of sustainable forestry management, which continues to be important because we do take our environmental credentials very seriously. And so I give construction materials only as an example of one sector in which we are working hard to ensure that there's a response on the supply side. There's a response on the supply side to the rapid escalation in the demand. We're doing the same, for example, with food production. It's not an accident that we are investing as heavily as we are in increased food production. We're building out roads that will increase acreage. We're probably building roads. We're building a new road from on the Quarantine Highway, from number 52 and number 58 villages to Kanji Creek. We are building those two roads, from number 52 and 58 to Kanji Creek, and extending the road at Molson Creek all the way up to where the new bridge across the Quarantine River will land. That's a place called El Dorado, and then beyond. Together, those roads on the Quarantine will probably open up another 50,000 acres of very fertile and arable land. We are, of course, also doing the same in West Demerara. We're doing the same in Essequibo. And so all of those initiatives are intended to bring new acreage under cultivation, improve farm-to-market roads, like I said, to improve ease of access to farms and back to markets, because we recognize that with an economy that's growing as rapidly, there's going to be more demand in the markets, and we want to make sure that there's an appropriate supply side response. So we're not just doing this, when you hear the president speaking about emphasis on food production, this is not just something because it sounds nice, or it's not about, just making sure that there's a lot of thought and analysis goes into the fact that you're going to have increased demand for these products because the economy is growing more rapidly. More people are working, more companies are operating, more people are working, more persons have disposable income, they're buying goods and services, they're building homes, etc., etc. And so we need to make sure that there is an appropriate supply side response. And the same can be said for many other sectors. And so
Right.
Similarly, before I go off this point, even in the labor market, we want to make sure that people are trained so that they can. In an economy that's growing as rapidly as Guyana, there's a whole discussion. I see Dr. Ramdas smiling and nodding. There's a whole discussion that can be had about labor market. And so we are investing very heavily in training on the labor market side to ensure that there's a supply side in the labor market. We want to make sure that you have more trained construction workers, more trained welders, more trained mechanics, more trained engineers, and all of the skill sets that will be needed for the new economy. So your first question, Mahendra, was on overheating, which I think I answered. Can you give me a one-word reminder of what your second question was about?
Second question was around currency.
Right. Beautiful. So you raised the question about currency, and I suspect you know the answer. Now, there's a lot of emotional fixation about the currency. People feel that 2-to-1 will be better than 200-to-1. Now, I think everybody on this panel knows that exchange rate appreciation, and in particular rapid exchange rate appreciation, will in fact be extremely harmful to the competitiveness of the Guyanese economy. And you imagine that if you have rapid appreciation of the Guyanese dollar against, say, the US dollar, and the US is our largest trade partner, we export a lot of goods to the United States of America. Just think for a moment, if the Guyana dollar appreciates, the competitiveness of everything that we export to the United States of America will in fact be immediately undermined. And so while a stronger, so to speak, a stronger Guyanese dollar, meaning an exchange rate nominally that has the illusion that it's stronger because like I said, 100 to 1 instead of 200 to 1, or 2 to 1 instead of 200 to 1. While, it might, at a very simplistic, naive level, it might appear to be somehow better. It in fact is going to have devastating consequences for Guyanese exports, and will decimate the competitiveness of the Guyanese export sector. And like I said, I know that all of my fellow panelists know this, and can very easily articulate this. You're right. I mean, we hear this question all the time. What really matters is stability and predictability. What we really want is a stable exchange rate, so that anybody investing in Guyana doesn't have to worry about volatility. They don't have to worry about investing in an economy where they don't know what the exchange rate will be next year. They don't know whether their investment will retain its value. They don't know whether what they produce will retain its competitiveness, or whether they have to factor in exchange rate uncertainty when they do their financial projections. So what really matters is stability. And your successive PPP governments have worked very hard to achieve and preserve this stability.
All right, thank you, sir. Dr. Ganga, your chance to ask the minister a question, because in another 10 minutes we have to close.
Thank you, Dr. Ashni. That was excellent. Guyana indeed has an impressive record to lower imported cost inflation, and attempt to remove the bottlenecks on the supply side in all of the sectors. You just didn't say construction, but all of the sectors. I've been keeping my ears on the ground to listen to that. So that's excellent. My main concern is sustainability, and if you want a word for that, is maintenance. All our capital expenditures would have a long tail of maintenance expenditures with it, and in this regard, we need every penny of dollar that we could get out of the new industry. Now, the oil industry is a heavy user of roads, schools, health facilities, everything. There's no doubt it's a heavy user. Now, the windfall gains that we get, that's missing. As we look ahead, we think in terms of a balanced budget. Now, it would be government current and capital expenditures equal taxation. We need to steer in the direction of balancing our budget with taxation. We can't leave the oil sector out of the tax system. That's a big gap. We need to close that gap, and attempt to get the profits tax on the sale of the contractor's oil. If we don't do that, I see a sustainability problem looming. So what we're doing right now, just to move ahead and correct all those problems that we had in the past, okay, pre-2020, August 2nd, as you mentioned there, we're having government spending that's current plus capital equals the non-oil taxes plus the NRF, which is national savings. That money should have gone as national savings, and then we use the interest on that, I guess, as we are now doing to stabilize our currencies and other policies that the government wants to implement. The interest on the money that's parked in the New York Reserve. So we need to take a fresh look at that for our own good in terms of sustainability of our economy. Without that missing piece, we're going to have a problem down the road. The government's budget and its policy levers, including transfer payments and pensions and so forth, need to be sustainable. You need to be able to afford these things, and we need every penny. Guyana deserves its profit tax on that contractor oil sales. And the further point is, we shouldn't treat or even entertain it that the oil industry is like the airline industry. They bring in everything, and then they just deal with one element of gain. that they look at. We should treat them as an integrated part of the Guyana economy, and taxation is the missing link, is the missing part right there. So that's what I will say. And just one further caution: we should monitor that the non-oil sectors don't carry the load for the oil sector as a heavy user of our local resources. So, Dr. Tara, that's about what I would like to say, Dr. Ashni. I must say your supply side emphasis is excellent.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Dr. Ramdas, for that. If I may very quickly respond, first of all, I agree fully with your arguments about sustainability. That's a perfectly valid point, and it's something that we take, and as you know, that we have always taken very seriously in the People's Progressive Party, as in government. I mean, if you look back at our economic policy and economic track record, when we came into office previously in 1992, we had an unsustainable fiscal situation. We were essentially bankrupt. And it took a lot of very hard work, very difficult choices in many cases, very strong fiscal reforms to bring us back from a point where we were essentially insolvent as a country back to a position where we enjoy fiscal and debt sustainability. And that's a track record that we are, I believe, justifiably proud of. And we will continue to be mindful of how important it is to preserve our fiscal and debt sustainability going forward. In fact, if you look now at the numbers, you'll see that we moved from a point where Guyana's debt to GDP ratio was in excess of 600%. We've gotten to a point today where Guyana's debt to GDP ratio is less than 50%. And that didn't happen magically. It happened as a result of very careful management and very strong fiscal discipline. So, and we're going to continue to do this going forward. So your point about sustainability, first of all, I would say I agree with, certainly from the perspective of overall fiscal sustainability. You then quite rightly make the point about our investment in infrastructure and ensuring that these things are sustainable, because of course, correctly, as you observe, every investment in infrastructure brings, to use your words, a long tail of maintenance expenditure after it. And this is absolutely right. I mean, you're correct in that regard. And so every major investment that we make, we are mindful of the maintenance and operating costs that will come with it. And I couldn't agree with you more. That's why, I mean, as we are careful in selecting what we invest in, we're not investing, recklessly. And I mean, if you look at the investment portfolio, all of the projects, all of the large projects that we're doing are in fact essential projects around which there is a almost unanimous national consensus. If you think about it, the big project, what are the big projects? The bridge across the Demerara River. I don't think anybody would argue that there's need for a new bridge across the Demerara River. The gas to energy project, which is going to generate an additional 250 megawatts of power. I don't think anybody is going to argue that there's a long history of inadequate, unreliable, and expensive electricity production in Guyana. And so we're carefully selecting the investments that we're making in order to ensure that they meet this sustainability threshold, but also in order to ensure that they lay the foundation for long-term generation of economic activity, which will in turn generate additional productive activity, generate additional fiscal revenues, and therefore contribute to the fiscal sustainability objective. So, for example, the gas to energy project is an electricity generation project, 250 additional megawatts of power, which will enable us to reduce the cost of electricity by 50%, improving the supply and affordability of electricity, not only to households, but very importantly, to the productive sector. So you can now have industrial and manufacturing activity, which will then lay the foundation for the emergence of an industrial and manufacturing sector. And that in turn will generate productive activity. It will contribute to non-oil GDP. It will create jobs. It will generate incomes for the people of Guyana. So your point about sustainability is fully taken on board and fully agreed with. And in fact, we could have another hour of discussion about some of the things that we're doing to address that very sustainability imperative that you highlight. On the question of the taxation of the oil sector, I think it's important that we remember two things. One, so we're all in favor, of course, of maximizing government revenue within the parameters of preserving our competitiveness as a destination for investment. It's important that we remember two things. One, the history behind the negotiation and renegotiation of the fiscal terms that apply to the current arrangement with Exxon. We know that history already, and that has been amply debated in the public. And secondly, the importance of taking the taxation of the oil revenue, viewing this question from a comprehensive perspective. And there are many aspects of the fiscal framework that applies to the oil revenue, to the oil sector. You have taxation of profits, but that's only one component of the fiscal framework that applies to the sector. You have profit sharing, and you have royalties on gross production. And any analysis of the taxation of the oil sector has to be done from the perspective of all of these different aspects of the fiscal framework, not only taxation of profits, but also the other aspects, like I said, profit sharing and royalties on gross production. Now, we inherited, of course, an arrangement when we came into office, which is the existing PSA. We have committed, of course, to doing a new model PSA. You've seen that we've been doing work on that. We've also committed to going out to auction a number of new blocks, which we've said will present us with an opportunity potentially to realize new and more favorable terms going out. And the Vice President, I believe, in a recent interview addressed this issue exhaustively. And the point that he made repeatedly is that we must take a comprehensive view of the various parameters within comprising the comprehensive taxation of the sector. And I will repeat for emphasis, not only taxation of profits, but also profit share and royalties, because those three main components are the three main anchors around which the sector generates fiscal revenues for the government. Now, so I wanted to offer that point in response to your observation on the sector. And secondly, you mentioned, of course, the utilization of interest earned from the sovereign wealth fund and preservation of the capital. Now, that, of course, is the Norwegian model, what they call the bird in the hand model. So all of your oil revenues will go into the sovereign wealth fund, and you don't use any of the capital, so to speak. You don't use any of the revenues that are earned. You use only the returns that are earned on that balance. That's, like I said, the bird in the hand model or the Norwegian model. I want to make the following 2 points. One, Norway introduced their sovereign wealth. And Norway is a great model, and there's a lot about the Norwegian model that is worthy of emulation. And Norway is considered a huge success story, and we continue to look at Norway as a success story. And there's a lot that we have learned and will continue to learn from Norway. But it's important to understand and remember and recall, and I know, Dr. Ramdas, that you're familiar with this, but I'm saying this more for the non-expert viewers, members of the viewing public. Norway introduced their sovereign wealth fund when they had an oil and gas sector that was extremely mature. So they introduced their sovereign wealth fund, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, when they had an oil and gas sector that had been operating for 30 years. We introduced our sovereign wealth fund within a year of the oil and gas sector starting to produce. I mean, we had first oil, I think, in December 2019, if I'm not mistaken. In December 2021, we legislated the new NRF legal framework. So basically 2 years. And secondly, Norway introduced their bird in the hand formula at a time when they were already essentially an advanced economy. They were already a wealthy country. They already had all of the infrastructure that was needed in place. They already had a high degree of social development. They had a well-developed uh, education, healthcare, social safety nets. Very, very well. They were a prosperous country and a well-developed, advanced economy with a high degree of social development. Like I said, we are starting this from a standpoint where there are still significant developmental needs and gaps that have to be met. There's still a huge infrastructure gap in Guyana that has to be met. And when we consider the infrastructure gap, we're also considering that we have to lay the foundation, like you quite rightly said, we have to lay the foundation for a competitive non-oil economy, a point that you made just now, to make sure that the rest of the economy remains competitive and expands. So hence projects like the Gas to Shore project, the new roads that are opening up new lands, the transport infrastructure that will lay the foundation for a strong non-oil economy. That's an important point to note, that infrastructure, we have to make those investments in that infrastructure now. We can't wait until our oil and gas sector is mature, or wait until the sunset days of the oil and gas sector to start making the investments that are critical to ensuring the emergence of a strong non-oil economy. And we have to invest in the things that really matter to people. We have to invest in education now, to make sure that Guyanese people now get the skills that they need to participate in the new economy. We have to invest in public health care that Guyanese people get they've been waiting for a long time, that they get the benefit of good international quality health care. Those are critical needs, those are critical gaps that exist right now that we are committed to addressing. And so, while of course, maintaining that the Norwegian model is a very good model, this concept of saving the capital and only utilizing the return, one has to consider where we are as a country. And, given where we are as a country, what we have done is we've put in place a formula that strikes the right balance. We have put in place a formula that strikes the right balance between utilizing some of the oil revenues to meet the current needs, the current developmental needs of the country. That's, for example, the $607 million that we are going to be using in 2022, while at the same time saving for future generations. So the formula that we have introduced attempts to strike, and I believe attempts very successfully to strike the balance between meeting current developmental needs while at the same time saving for the future in order to serve the very sustainability objective that you articulate.
Mr. Minister, I just get a signal that we got to wrap up. I'm sorry, but we got to get you back here again.
I will stop. Dar. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
I want to thank you very much. I know you got the world. You represent the entire government, all the ministries. You can speak on their behalf. You have an enormous body of knowledge. So I want to put you on now. I want to thank the panelists. Bishop, sorry I couldn't bring you in because we're getting signal. We got to wrap up. So I put you on to our host,
That's quite.
Shamiz Ali.
The minister was quite eloquent and very elaborate.
Okay.
I have no questions anyway.
Okay, thank you. Shamiza? We're not hearing. We're not hearing you.
Well, we can wrap up for her.
I believe you need to unmute your mic, Shamiza.
Yeah, we are not hearing. Or something wrong.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right. My apologies, guys. I am traveling, so I apologize for that. I would like to thank our panel for tonight. I would like to thank our moderator. And I'd also like to thank Dr. Singh, our viewers. It was indeed an interesting show, and I would love for you to be back with us, Dr. Singh, because there's so much more that we would like to know about tonight's topic. Again, thank you, everyone. This is the Guyana Dialogue. Until next time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you
Singh.
very
All
much.
the best, and take care and
Thank you.
continue the great works.
Thanks.
Guyana, you're a
Enjoy,
proud son
enjoy
of
Washington.
Guyana.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me, and thank you very much to all of the panelists for coming and joining me and for the very interesting discussion.
Mahendra, you have a final word for the
And
minister.
thanks to the viewers as well for joining us.
Mahendra, you have a final word.
Looking forward to the budget, Dr. Singh.
You're looking forward to the budget.
Yes.
Very good. Thank you very
Any
much.
concluding remarks, Dr. Ganga?
Well, as I said, the minister has his hands on all of the policy levers.
Yeah.
So I feel very confident that we're in good hands.
Okay.
So I want to thank you for that.
Thank you, and everybody. If you're traveling, have a safe trip. I think
Evening.
there's some storm. And thank you, Honorable Minister. And we'll